Welcome to Step Into the Pivot. We're your hosts. I'm Teresa Conti.
And I'm Ivana Polonio. We talk with people just like you. We have honest conversations about current issues that women and men face and how we pivot to address them in our lives.
This podcast is your companion as you step into a workout or take some time for yourself.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Step Into the Pivot. We are so happy to have you listening to us again this week to this very important, which you will understand later, topic we're going to talk about today. So thank you, Scott Kelley, for being our guest today and for taking the time to talk about this. I'm excited to hear what you have to say and, that we can all learn from this. So thank you, Scott, for being here with us today.
You bet. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Thank you, Scott. We're so honored to have you join us. You are a very active contributor in the retirement plan industry. As our guests know, we publish everybody's bio. It's associated with the show notes. There's so much we could read about you from the perspective of everything that you've done. And, your veteran is a really good word, right? Your presence in the industry has been really deep. And what I want to highlight from knowing you as an industry professional, first and foremost, is your authenticity, your willingness to help. One of the first ways in which we met was you approached me and asked how you can help with certain nonprofit initiatives that help, just raise awareness around being human in the world of business, women's issues, diversity questions. You are also, I know, very passionate about essentially plain Englishing what can be a very complicated environment and technical jargon, and just teaching what it's like to be immersed in this industry of finance and financial wellness. I mean that very broadly speaking, and in particular as it comes to retirement. So I met you as someone who is always like, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And Scott, what was really then moving is when you raised your hand to share about your own story of being going through something where, asking for help, not receiving help, helping yourself. Tell us about it. Tell us about the big story in your life, the pivot that hit you, that 40-pound bag of lemons you didn't expect, or maybe in your case, like 400-pound bag of lemons. What happened? Where were you?
That's a good way to put it. A 400-pound bag of lemons. That's kind of what it felt like. So just to set the stage a little bit, I was, let's see, about 10 years into my career, but 3 years into the job that I always wanted, which was out there as a investment wholesaler. Happened to be on the retirement side, which turned out to be a great thing. But I was doing everything that I possibly could to be successful, and sometimes pushing myself to extraordinary limits. Running, as I like to say in quotes, running hard. I in preparation for today, I went back and looked, and it was actually a Wednesday in the middle of the week, and it's been about 10 years, so the details get a little foggy, but I know that I had I needed to pack and head over to Sacramento. At the time, I lived in the Bay Area. My wife and I lived in an apartment, right? Or she wasn't my wife at the time, or just barely was. It's hard to remember, but we lived in an apartment right above a coffee shop, and I had one of my meetings set up in the coffee shop below our apartment. And then I had to go from the coffee shop back up to the apartment, pack my bag, and head over to Sacramento because our chief economist was coming out and doing presentations, and I was a part of them, and I had to introduce them, and it was a kind of a stressful week, right? Like I was my schedule was very tight, and I was pretty stressed out, to be honest with you. Back then was very much the norm. And so I went down and I did the meeting. It's somebody that I at that time and still consider a great friend in the industry, and had a great meeting, parted ways, walked upstairs, probably said something to my now wife about being stressed out, and then I have to pack packed my suitcase and hit the road, and my phone rang, and it was my mom. And it was about 7 days after my birthday. So, I kind of thought, well, I just talked to my mom for my birthday. I wonder what this is about. And I answered the phone, and she was just absolutely in hysterics, trying to communicate to me that my brother had committed suicide. It took several attempts for her to convey that news, as she was hysterical, and for good reason. And when you said 400-pound bag of lemons, I mean that's it. That's what it felt like. I mean, I can still feel that feeling of just having everything sucked out of you at once. Is the way I describe it, and absolutely having no idea what to do. I just didn't know what to do. And um, luckily for me, my wife sort of took over in that moment, and she reached out to my boss. She reached out to, the people that I was supposed to go meet with in Sacramento that were helping put on the event and such. And then she went into travel agent mode and got me plane tickets and hotels for our whole family to fly to Texas to where this had all happened. And so that's pretty much the story of how I found out. And from there, I got on an airplane, and I think I kind of came out of shock on the airplane. I can remember that pretty clearly, being on the plane and just looking around at the people on the airplane and thinking how many times I've been on an airplane and never realized that somebody else sitting in that airplane could be going through something like that, and I'd have no idea, right? Like that was a memory that I had. But to wrap up the story of how it happened, we went to Texas, and I want to say by Saturday we had put together a memorial and gotten through, sort of rushed through all of the stuff that happens when somebody passes away. So
you talk about, rushing through, right? You've talked about that quite a bit. And when we talked earlier, you talked about that too. So talk about the aftermath, right? Like, did you still continue to rush? Did you take the time you needed? When did you pause to really think about that? Or did you?
yeah, it's a great question because I really didn't. I was back on an airplane. I think straight from the funeral to Portland, Oregon, where I now live, but I didn't at the time, for at least Tuesday meetings. If I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday after the service, but I'll never forget standing in a lobby of one of the big buildings in Portland, waiting for the retail wholesaler to show up, and 8 a.m. in the morning on Tuesday morning, let's say. What is that? Not even 7 days after my brother committed suicide. And I just remember standing there thinking for a second, what am I doing here? Right? Like this is crazy. And then I just did what I have always done, which said to myself, tough it out, move forward. I don't want anybody to see that I, was affected by this, and I don't want to show any weakness whatsoever. And the only way to do that is just to not miss any more meetings. I already missed the ones in Sacramento, which, people listening may think sounds ridiculous, but I felt guilty for that. And so I was just in Portland, still, running my territory, doing what I do every day. And I think it's important to say the company I worked for at the time, it wasn't them that expected that, right? Like they were probably shocked that I was doing that. And if I remember right, many people said, take time, why are you coming back to work so early? And I just, again, for fear of showing weakness, I just pushed forward and insisted that I just keep living up to my career and work obligations. So, yeah, just pushing forward.
So, it's clear that you are someone who's listening, and maybe that's to what's happening underneath the surface, and maybe that's not, something that always came as a, all right, let me actually check in with myself and see what's really happening here. But you just said it, like I wrote it down here, for fear of showing weakness. So it looks like, you've done some unpacking and understanding of, what was really happening here, um, underneath it all, underneath the needs to tough it out, underneath the, the rushing through. And, even though it sounds like in the moment when you got the news and you hit the brakes really hard and you have your beloved wife, taking over, pretty soon you mobilize again and you just, you keep going and you keep going. So tell us about the inner work that you've done, any techniques, anything that that helped you go deeper, and then possibly, what came, if you're open to sharing, what were some of the things you needed to look at that were underneath this, like, I gotta tough it out, I can't show weakness, I'm letting people down if I'm not showing up.
Yeah. I pushed forward, if that's the phrase that we're using for ignoring, the self introspection that I needed to do for about 6 years. I mean, and really when it became clear was during well, I was the company I worked for was acquired and I was part of the layoffs, and so all of a sudden I didn't have this thing to distract myself or push through that took all my focus. And then COVID happened, so it was even more so. So about 6 years of pushing forward until one day it was kind of like that was gone, and it was pretty obvious to me that that I had not really ever taken the time to think through, what does it mean when your only sibling commits suicide? What how do you deal with that? How do you move forward? What does the future look like? um and just addressing how I felt about it was a big process. And for me it was, it was always kind of there, right? But I just ignored it. I just ignored the fact that, I mean, I knew that I wasn't addressing it, but I ignored it. And having time that I didn't have something to distract myself is what really made that glaring. And so I went to therapy, not afraid to admit it. I found, which, I personally think is kind of an overused cliche, go to therapy, right? Like everybody says it like it's some magical thing. And quite frankly, I think there's a lot of really bad therapists out there. But, if you find somebody that you can work through some of this stuff with, that's what did it for me, is just realizing, that there was so many broader aspects to this whole situation that I needed to work through, that I probably should, set aside my brother's suicide, that I should have worked through a long time ago, that, really came to light. And, there's something, there's positive and negative to realizing these things, right? Like sometimes, there is a bliss in ignorance. Sometimes, right? I sometimes look back and say, God, it sure was nice when I just distracted myself with work and I didn't have to deal with any of this, because it's not easy. And I hope that in addressing these things in therapy and talking about it with people and trying to be open, that I hope that pivot pays off, right? But I'm also the first person to admit that I don't know yet, right? Like I just don't. I'm not some great success story where I dealt with these things and I lived happily ever after. I mean, I'm living and I'm happy, but it's not ever after, right? So, does that make sense?
Totally. And you're in the process of it, right? It's a process. And we were joking as we were preparing to hit the record button about your background, because you were saying, blurring, not blurring, do I keep it? And then you decided to keep it because we were saying what a metaphor for, like, you're still unpacking. So the reason your background looks the way it does is, Scott, because share with our listeners what's happening in there.
Yeah, so my wife and I moved into this house. It's over a year ago, and my office is still incomplete. And so I blur my background many times on video, but I decided to not blur it today, because I think these unpacked boxes are a good metaphor for, the process that I'm going through, right? Like it's like moving into a house. Like you have to learn where to focus your energy, and we've focused it on other rooms of our house, and my office has just been neglected. And that's the background. There's picture frames and open boxes back there that I'm still going through. So good analogy for the process of dealing with all of
Yeah.
that.
As we were preparing for the show, you did tell us about one particular example of something that came out of your inner work and also just working through, step-by-step situations that were part of the aftermath that I think are a really good example of something that you did that was different. And I would showcase that as growth, transformation, and you doing things differently. And even though, of course, you're not done because it's never over, spoiler alert, right? We're all always going to keep, working through things. Tell us about the family dynamic and the constellation that you ended up having an aha moment about, and then saying something to your family members about, I'm not doing this anymore.
Yeah. So
I'm referring to your
yeah,
relay.
my parents were divorced when I was in college, and which was ironically probably when my brother and I became closest, is when my parents went through their divorce. And but in dealing with my brother's suicide is when I really learned that I had become like the switchboard operator between my parents. They were divorced, and although they were somewhat cordial, they were not good at communicating, and I became sort of the operator that relayed messages in between the two of them, and that just got absolutely blown out of proportion with my brother's suicide, because they had a difficult time communicating effectively, but they both could communicate with me, and so I became this de facto middleman. And one of the things I've had to do in my life is, um, you know, I really don't like cliches, but I'm going to use one here. I've had to set boundaries with both of my parents on, not being that middleman, because it really put a lot of responsibility on me to make sure that, those lines of communication, even in a broken up family, there's still, obviously when somebody commits suicide, there's things that need to be talked about and communicated. I've learned that I've lived pretty much since their divorce as that switchboard operator, and that's just not a healthy place for anybody to be. So, setting those boundaries with my parents has been one of the, I guess, silver linings of this. Again, it's a process. It doesn't always work how I would like it to work, but we're getting there. So.
Yeah. Well, we're down to kind of our last couple of minutes here. And, first of all, I want to thank you again for sharing this very important story, right? We're in September, and September is Suicide Prevention Month. So we thought it was really important that we share this story this month. And, it's really brave in a lot of ways to share this with others, right? It's some of those things and some of those lessons we learn. And, I really appreciate it. I've enjoyed getting to know you and really do appreciate this. So let's talk just briefly, kind of our final question. You said to us, right, your wife said to you at one point, you guys were talking about something and you've been through a lot. And I think that's really true based on what you've told us today. But can you talk about how this pivot was a step forward for you?
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly when, but at one point my wife looked at me in all sincerity and said, "You've been through a lot." And I'm sure somebody had said that to me before, but for some reason that having somebody else recognize or tell me that it was okay to admit that there's been a lot of stuff that I've had to go through was the moment, and that I just sort of was able to accept it myself. And I don't know how common it is, but I know it's somewhat common for people to do what I did, which is just not address things and not try, don't want to show weakness in a situation like this. And having somebody say to me, "You've been through a lot," was when I finally realized, like, it's okay to admit that these things are hard, and try to move forward and work through them. And so if there's anybody that I try to say things like that to people now, and I may not be the one that gets through to them, but if enough people start saying things like that, eventually people that are going through challenging situations may feel like I did, where it's almost like I could finally admit to myself that, yeah, I have been through a lot. So
Yeah. And you said it earlier too, right? You never know what the person sitting next to you is going through. You got on that plane, and you never know what's going on in somebody else's life. So I love that you said that, Scott. And we really do appreciate that you shared your story with us today.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Scott. This is an important month, and the statistics are really, very challenging too, in terms of how often folks are impacted, whether it's somebody who's actually having, suicidal thoughts, or a family member, living in the vicinity of the experience, going through the experience. It's more common than we talk about. And so for you to bravely raise your hand and say, "I'll share about my experience," we so appreciate that. Absolutely. Teresa, I was going to highlight the same thing, that moment on the plane when you have the awareness of, like, wow, now I'm deep in it. How many times have I not, given the benefit of the doubt to, the cranky person next to me? I think those are the magical moments, really, of, deep human connection. I also wanted to say, I've said this before, but it's, you set it up so beautifully with the boundary. My experience is that cliches are cliches, and they can be kind of annoying that way until they become a lived experience. So then when you have the experience of, like, knowing how to be in that, no, this doesn't work for me, all of a sudden it's a completely different thing, right? And so thank you for being here and demoing, how to move past cliches into the real, deep, authentic sincerity and genuine caring and genuine connection. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank
I
you,
appreciate it.
everybody.
All right, awesome. Okay, thank you everybody for listening. Thank you again to Scott Kelley. Thank you, Ivana. This is a very important week, and there's lots of things you can look at if you know somebody who may be having a hard time, or you need help yourself because of a family member or something else. So please remember that there are lots of tools and resources to you, and we will talk with you next week. Thank you again for listening to Step Into the Pivot.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Step Into the Pivot. We hope you found inspiration and valuable insights from our conversation. Remember, life is a series of pivots, and it's in those moments of change that we truly grow.
If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected, make sure to check out our websites. You'll find additional resources, behind-the-scenes content, and more details about our incredible guests. We love hearing from listeners, so reach out with your thoughts, questions, or your own pivot stories.
To keep the conversation going, be sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Instagram, where we share updates, quotes, and engage with our amazing community.
If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Your feedback makes a difference, and it helps us bring you meaningful conversations. We're signing off, reminding you that every pivot is a step forward. Take care, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Step Into the Pivot.